When I first started making beats, I made a few bad choices that cost me thousands of dollars and wasted years of my time. So that's why I'm making this video. I'll walk you through all the mistakes I made, the 3 major lessons I learned from these boneheaded moves, and what I wish I did instead, so you can learn from my mistakes. Let's rewind 15 or so years ago. I'm a regular guy who has zero musical experience, but I absolutely love beats. I look at producers like they're magical wizards, so I want to learn how to become one of them. But the problem is I'm stuck. My beats don't sound as good as I want them to, and I don't know why. At the time, I remember I was watching a lot of live streams of Ninth Wonder making beats, and I thought I was just doing the exact same thing he was. I was using samples, I was adding my own drums and bass lines to those samples, but no matter what I tried, my beats just didn't come together. And this is the beginning of where I started to make some really costly mistakes. To figure out what my problem was with my beats, I tried looking up advice on the internet, and I saw a lot of people say this one thing over and over again that I still see people say to this day. You need to learn how to mix and master. And at the time, I didn't know much about mixing and mastering, but I was happy when I read this. I thought, finally, I found a solution to my problem. A few weeks later, I joined the first mixing and mastering class that I could find. I still have the bill for it in my closet. I paid $795 to join this class. It's a lot of money, but I'm a firm believer in paying for skills and knowledge so I don't have to spend my own time to learn it. But this is where I make my first mistake. Again, I joined this class because I wanted a firm answer on what I can do to improve my beats. But here's the problem with a lot of programs, in my opinion. They are very rigid and there's a lot of fluff. I remember like 5 weeks into the program, the instructor was teaching us how to properly wrap audio cables. And as I was standing there folding this wire around my arm, I just thought, this is pointless. I don't need to know this. And even worse, I didn't even get an opportunity to ask for help with my music since the curriculum was so rigid and set. So after I graduated, I was still stuck with the exact same problems with my beats. And that's how I learned lesson number 1. Find a solution that actually caters to your needs. So after wasting nearly $1,000 on that program, I decided that one-on-one help would be a better idea. That way I could ask questions directly. Ask a friend if he knows anyone, and he says he knows a guy who mixes and masters, and this guy is cheap. He can mix and master 5 of my beats for $1,000. Mind you, at the time I was living paycheck to paycheck, so this was also a lot of money. But I take beat making seriously. It's something that I really care about, and I really want to figure out what was wrong with my beats. So I was happy to spend my hard-earned money on this guy to get one-on-one help, but this is where lesson number 2 smacks me hard in my face. I remember texting this guy and I asked him where his studio was, and he gave me an address. I show up to that address and it's this weird dilapidated house in the middle of some random neighborhood, and I think this must be a mistake. I text the guy and I tell him I think I'm outside, and he comes out of the front door and he's like, hey man, come in, welcome. By the way, don't mind the noise, there's 4 other people living in this house, but I rent out the basement. As I'm walking through, this place feels like it's a crack den and I'm already starting to feel regret, but I think, hey, you know what, maybe this guy, he's a young guy, he's just getting a start, and we all gotta start somewhere, right? So I give him a chance. Well, it becomes clear to me that this was a mistake. Whenever I ask him questions about what he's doing as he's mixing, he isn't able to provide any clear answers. He's just following a formula someone else gave him. Even worse, he spends half the time talking about how he's a major player on the dark web and how he could hire assassins if he wanted to. In the end, he mixes my beats. They are still unmastered because he forgot to do that step, and the mix on the beats just doesn't sound great at all. And this is where I learned lesson number 2. You get what you pay for. I know when you first start making beats, some of you might be a bit young and not in a great spot financially. That is fine. I still think you're able to acquire a lot of skills in the meantime. But let's be honest. For example, there's a difference between this plugin and this plugin. Often things are cheap or free for a reason, and I learned this the hard way. So up until this point, I've spent nearly $2,000 and I'm still stuck with the same problem. I still want to figure out what's wrong with my beats though, which leads me into mistake number 3. I decide to do a one-on-one with someone who actually is a seasoned professional. I find a guy in Google, he's got a decade plus worth of experience, and he actually has a professional studio. If I remember correctly, I think his service was something like $2,500 to mix and master the same 5 beats for me. And I'll say, to his credit, he was very knowledgeable, and working with him was very positive. I could see why paying the extra money was worth it. But this is where problem number 3 starts to come in, and it's probably the most important lesson that I learned. I brought in reference tracks for how I wanted my beats to sound, and when I played it for him, he said, perfect. I know exactly how to do this with your music. And I remember I just felt relieved. So he goes through the whole mixing and mastering process, and I'm sitting there watching what he does, trying to learn what I can. But by the end of it, my beats still don't sound how I want them to. They still have the same problem, even after paying him all this money. I tried to point out how my music still doesn't sound like the references that I brought in, but he just didn't understand what I was talking about. And that's when it dawned on me. He was hearing as an engineer would. He was listening for how the sounds were EQ'd, how the dynamics felt, what mastering tools were used. He had an entirely different frame of reference than me, a beat maker. And so it made sense he didn't have the solutions to my beat making problems because he wasn't a beat maker. He didn't even understand what my problem was. And this is lesson number 3. So often when I read people's advice online about how to make better beats, their solution is go learn this other thing. Sometimes people say it's mixing and mastering, other people say it's music theory. But for me and many others, this is just not the right solution to our problem. Do you want to know what the right answer was for me? After spending years of time saving up all that money and then spending it on the wrong thing over and over, do you want to know what the solution to my beat making problem was? I put too much reverb on my snare. Literally, that's 80% of what messed up all my beats. The problem was the engineers thought this was a creative decision, since some genres do put some reverb on snares, but when it comes to beats, you don't really do that often. And so if I just could have asked an experienced beat maker these questions instead of a mixing engineer or a music theory teacher, the solution to my problem could have come much sooner. When I was watching Ninth Wonder make beats, I thought I was doing what he was doing. But the problem was I was only learning the what and the how. I wasn't actually learning the why, and the why is what matters the most. Why do you choose one snare over another? Why do you use certain keyboard presets for certain genres? Why should you make your bass notes longer or shorter? These are the questions that experienced beatmakers know the answers to. Beatmaking has its own fundamental principles that you rarely ever see talked about, even on YouTube. And if you just stick to learning tips and tricks and hacks, you don't actually learn any of this. So be careful about what you watch on YouTube. And I want to say, for some of you, you shouldn't even listen to me either. It's important to say that I don't know everything. If your goal is to win a Grammy, for example, I don't have any advice worth giving because I've not accomplished this. Or if you want to learn how to conduct an orchestra, I have no idea. I've spent 15 plus years making beats. In that time, I've worked with some great artists, I've gotten millions of streams of my own music, so I do feel confident that I can show you how to become a better beat maker. This is the reason why I started my own YouTube channel and eventually why I built my course. It's to explain the whys that worked for me. But beyond that, my advice might not be the best fit for you. So the next time you see a tutorial on how to make a hit song and it's made by a producer who hasn't even gotten their beats used by a single artist, just be careful. And that is my last big takeaway that I want to share and hopefully save you years of time and money. If you found this video helpful, hit like and subscribe. Next to me is another video where I recall some really horrible beatmaking experiences that I went through when I first started. So click it if you're interested, but if not, I will see you next week. Bye bye.